This we are going to get out of here.
Yeah, after all 4 years we've been together.
What are you going to do after this then?
I think maybe I want to go to some places that people do not explore yet, or maybe some mysterious places, so that I can go there and live alone, far from anybody.
You mean a place that no one's ever explored yet?
No, I mean that.
Well, I'm sorry, but I believe that's quite impossible.
Yeah, what?
But that's a different thing. If you would like to travel to the other planet, maybe.
Oh, this means that there was no more dark places in the map to explore, conquer and convert.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, okay. That means after the scramble for Africa, where European race lay claims territory for European to compete in the war, to compete over.
Yeah.
I think starting from 1880 until First World War. But then, for the savages, they think that is for romance.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah. For my opinion, they only used to provide lots of opportunities for the European. You know, we give lots of new places for them to explore.
Yeah.
And when colonialism gets to, you know, getting bigger,
Mhm.
they kill all the adventures. There's no longer places that we could explore,
I think so.
isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe we could explore another planet, I think.
I'm waiting for that.
Okay, you know what? With exploration and then the apparatus of colonial rule, the world was divided into the safe place, known world, and the non-west, with the later characterized by magic and mystery, you know?
Wow.
Wow.
I miss you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One more thing,
Yeah.
process of colonialism and imperialism opened up another list by domesticating and ordering it. However, they read each with otherness, exotism and excitement, because there's no excitement when we go to place that people has explored.
But what you can do? There's no longer an explored place. They are all finished. You can look at the map and there's
Full.
names for all places. But I believe that we have the same opinion with Joanne P. Sharp. Did you ever read that book?
John P. Sharp, the book that Dr. Lajiman gave us.
Yes, not Joanne P. Mana.
Oh,
Joanne P. Sharp.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
Joanne P. Sharp mentioned in the book, and I believe that global modernization was driven by colonialism, and they kill the adventure, like what I said before. And no wonder Joseph Conrad felt disappointed.
Joseph who?
Joseph Conrad, you don't know?
No?
You sure?
Who is he?
Wait. Picture of Joseph Conrad. Look, this is Joseph Conrad.
Serious, yeah?
Don't you know?
Why do you keep his picture in your wallet, man?
Well, I believe that is something related with me. I think he look like me. Well, you might look at the quotes.
Oh, coach.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
about his feelings.
May I read it?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, now when I was a little child, I had a passion for maps. I would look for hour at South America, Africa, and Australia, and lose myself in all the glories of exploration. At that time, there were many blank spaces on the earth, and when I saw one that looked particularly inviting on a map, but they all look like that, I would put my finger on it and say, when I grow up, I will go there. Oh, just like me, want to go to another places.
Yeah.
The North Pole was one of these places I remember. Well, I haven't been there yet and shall not try it now. The glamours of other places were scattered about the equator and in every sort of latitude all over the two hemispheres. I have been in some of them, and well, we won't talk about that. But there was one yet, the biggest, the most black. So to speak, I had a hankering after. True, by this time it was not a blank space anymore. It had got filled since my boyhood with rivers and lakes and names. It has ceased to be a blank space, delightfully mystery, a white patch for a boy to dream gloriously over. It had become a place of darkness. But there was in it one river, especially a mighty big river, that you could see on the map resembling an immense snake uncoiled, with its head in the sea, its body at rest, curving afar over a vast country, and its tail lost in the depth of the land. Oh, nice, good.
Right. I believe that you are having the same problem with Jose Conrad. Now you know Jose Conrad. You can keep that picture. I know you like it. Hey, I have some videos that maybe you would like to watch this video.
Sure.
It's something interesting about this conversation we're having right now.
Okay, before this, you have heard the explanation about the end of the blank space on the map. Now, I'm going to explain about the decolonization. It is relied heavily on the power of knowledge, which is the idea of knowing the native in order to control them. Primarily, some Asian and middle-level government of their country, the decolonization creates a post-colonial national identity, which allow possibilities for diverse population to imagine themselves as a community with a common interest, history, and identity. So,
for example, in India, British introduced map, railway and introduced English as a common language of governance. English also allowed elites to communicate easily where they had previously been hindered by the existence of many indigenous languages. An Indian historian, Prata Chatterjee, had argued that the problem with this explanation of events is that it is still the West that is the hero of the story. The colonized society remains passive in the story because they have to wait for the arrival of the colonists to develop their society and bring reason in the first place. Chatterjee suggests that it is as if the Europeans have thought out on our behalf not only the script of colonial enlightenment and exploitation, but also that of our anti-colonial resistance and post-colonial misery. Even our imagination must remain forever colonized. Chatterjee offers a different version of the story, wherein the colonized society creates its own domain of knowledge and value. He suggests that under colonial regime, social life was divided into two domains, the material and the spiritual. First, the material. This was the public space outside the home, where the economy, statecraft, and science and technology were dominated by the colonial power. For the spiritual, it is the private space of the home and the traditional culture of the colonized society, which were represented during the colonialism.
go.
So I have said that the structural difference between the Occident and the Orient have remained the same throughout the country. Some have criticized him for being lack of historical awareness. Shohat and Stem have reworked Sykes' theory further to argue that in the middle of the 20th century, we have seen a significant change in the nature of the Occident as USA rose to the hegemonic dominance and having unparalleled influence on the political shape of the world, but also in the term of cultural production.
Order of Orientalism were reconfigured as modernization theory and development. There have been various different variants of this, but most famously coming from Rostow's 1960 book Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. The title of the book makes clear the new context for the post-colonial world order, the Cold War. Rostow's vision was of development, which was driven by capitalism rather than communism, and thus it provided an alternative ideology to that followed by the Soviet Union and its allies. This was seen as a new, positive, post-colonial world order, one in which the differences between rich and poor would decrease and every country could make a good. As we can see from the opening quote for this chapter, it was a period of great optimism. US President John F. Kennedy confidently proclaimed the 1960s the decade of development and insisted that within 10 years the differences between the level of economic development between the West and elsewhere could be overcome. This then was an image of a truly post-colonial world order. The USA had been such a strong advocate of decolonization that the image it presented of the new US-centered world order was one based around equality. Despite its egalitarian protestation, the USA desired the end of colonialism primarily to destroy trade relations between colonizer and colonies. The US economy was growing rapidly, producing goods for an American consumer society. However, while North America was a large continent, it remained a limited market. And to ensure that growth could continue, the USA needed to ensure a larger market. Therefore, it wanted a global free market, unimpeded by these special relationships between countries and their former colony, which made US goods more expensive in these countries. At the end of the Second World War, the USA had given vast amount of aid to Europe in the form of the Marshall Plan. This was the first ever example of development aid. There were arguments related to altruism, but the main driver behind this was to ensure that Europeans would be able to afford US goods. The economies of European countries had to be rebuilt so that US goods could be sold, and without dynamic markets in Europe, US industrial growth could not be maintained. Thus, some have argued that development programs to the ex-colonies were similarly targeted at developing market for US consumer goods. At the same time, a weak economy was seen to offer a situation that would make a country vulnerable to take over by the USSR. American geopolitics therefore suggested that it was important to bolster the economies of post-colonial countries to ward off the dangers of communism. Despite an apparent break from the past, the worldview of development was still based on a hierarchical and patronizing model of the world, that there were developed and developing nations. Rostow and the others presented the world as if all its countries could be located along one linear path to development, with the USA in the present and other countries located somewhere behind but aspiring to achieve the same height.
The concept of the First World originated during the Cold War and included countries that were generally aligned with or on friendly terms with the United States, including all NATO countries, and were generally identified as non-theocratic democracies with primarily market-based economies. While there is no current consensus on an exact definition of the term,
In modern usage, the first world country generally implies a relatively wealthy, stable, and functional non-theocratic democracy with a reasonably well-educated population, or just any developed country. After World War II, the world split into two large geopolitical blocs, separating into spheres of communism and capitalism. This led to the Cold War, during which the term First World was often used because of its political, social, and economic relevance. The term itself was first introduced in the late 1940s by the United Nations. Today, the First World is slightly outdated and has no official definition. However, it is generally thought of as the capitalist, industrial, wealthy, and developed countries. The First World, led by the USA, is based around free market capitalism and political freedom in democracy. Western theorists describe them to be the national expression of modernity, in that things are presumed to follow their own course without any intervention. On the other hand, the Second World, led by the USSR, offers an alternative model of development, one which Western theorists view as being distorted by ideology, the intervention in the market, and the control of freedom by the state. The Second World was understood to be modern, but it was contaminated with mixture of ideology that prevented it from being efficient and natural. First World country will be dedicated to the countries that practice democracy and have high average income for the resident, while Second World country will be communist or countries that have average income generally.
First world, second world, third world? Yeah. Well, first world and second world, I think I can understand. But third world, it's so hard to understand.
Hello there.
Yes.
You have problem with understanding the third world?
Yeah, of course.
Wow, really?
Go.
Well, really? What does the third world mean exactly? Now, for those of you who jump right through the Ethiopia or Zimbabwe and chose them as an example of the third world country, you might be surprised as I will reveal the true first world country.
Countries would be placed in the following groups. Some first world countries would be Zimbabwe, Iran, and Papua New Guinea. Some second world countries would be Ethiopia, Vietnam, and Poland. While some third world countries would be Sweden, Ireland, Chile, and Saudi Arabia. So you're probably thinking, what? Sweden's a third world country while Zimbabwe's a first world country?
Go.
Wait, what? Are you kidding me? Well,
If I were to add 4 more countries to this list, you'd understand these placements a lot better. Those countries are the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdoms, and China. They're being grouped depending on the countries they were allied with during the Cold War. And this was the original way to determine which world group your country would be placed in. It had little to do with money and more so politics. So the concept of first, second, and third world countries was coined by the United Nations. It was put together in the 1940s to organize the countries that were around during the Cold War. Countries that were allied with the United States were considered first world countries, while countries that were allied with the Soviet Union were considered second world countries, and lastly, countries that remained neutral throughout the whole affair were considered third world countries.
this map right here will show you the countries and its specific lions.
Blue being first world countries, red being second world countries, and green being third world countries.
Hopefully by now we're all savvy enough to stop saying third world countries, but saying developing nations sounds condescending too. We usually end up calling them those nations, which might be even worse. Which nations? Those nations over there. Don't touch them. So what should we call those nations? First off, the term Third World is really wrong. It comes from the 1950s, and at the time, the First World meant countries aligned with the West or the United States. The Second World was nations aligned with communist Russia. This only sort of made sense then, and makes absolutely no sense now. As for the Third World, that referred to everything else. It includes those nations we mean when we say Third World, but it also included places like Greenland and the United Arab Emirates. It was too general, and as such, not super useful. So what about the term developing nations? India, China, and Brazil are actively developing and sort of fit into that category, but people tend to call those newly industrialized countries, or they just call them India, China, and Brazil. Developing nations also include places like Syria and Somalia, but they aren't developing at all. In fact, they're spiraling. So the word developing in developing nations doesn't actually mean anything. You could say poor nations, but not if you go off their GDP. Currently, Iraq is 56th on the UN's list, and Iceland is 123rd. When you're talking about poverty, you don't usually mean Iceland. So for the last time, what should you say? Well, it's awkward and long, but you should say countries on the UN's list of least developed nations, which is a mouthful, but it's accurate. These 48 countries on the official and somewhat regularly updated list are those nations. Granted, it doesn't include all the nations people mean when they throw around those other terms, but when you're talking about world poverty, this is the place to start.
Technologists studied the Third World once the effect of modernization had taken hold, and they are considered as specialists in that area. People who studied Second World were considered area specialists. Their focus was on the distortion created by the communist ideology. They were doing so in order to study the effect of communism or socialism had on their normal society, rather than examining the societies for themselves. The people who studied the First World were assumed to be more properly systematic. They examined economic process or came up with theories of political behavior or social formation. It was assumed that there were no effects of ideology in the First World, therefore it was acknowledged as uniformly modern.
For those of you who jump right through the Africa, Segel, what are those? Hello there. Yeah.
Buat apa tu? Abang asyik tak ada duit bang nak pergi.